Awesome. Well, here we go. Welcome back, everyone. I'm here in Zoomland with my man, Ted Cross, product development manager of Novi Labs and creator, author of the Unearthed Substack. Ted, welcome to the show, man. How you doing today, buddy?
Glad to be here, Justin. Thanks for having me. Really excited to get into our topics today. I think we have a lot of interesting things to chat about, stuff going on in the industry. So glad to be on here.
Yeah, no, it's cool, man. And for those who might watch on YouTube, I have a bunch more people who actually listen to the podcast and watch it on YouTube. I'm trying to do it all, like the YouTube, the TikTok. It's just like when you're a one man band, it's hard to get it on everything. But I finally managed to get it on YouTube. You've got the whiteboard behind me. You're in the middle of a move, Ted. Let's like unpack that. Like that's moving offices is a pain in the butt. Used to work for a large corporate company, so I'm sure you know all about that. But how's the move? You're moving into WeWork. Like, what's the deal here?
Yeah, well, our evolution at Novi over the past 5 years is kind of representative of the broader tech industry. We're a data analytics, machine learning software provider for oil and gas. And back when I hired on in 2019, we found it really easy to attract high quality software talent and data science talent here in Austin.
Okay.
But like a lot of the rest of the industry, when the downturn hit, those skill sets became incredibly highly in demand, and we had to look all over the country to hire people, actually all over the world. We have folks in Texas, Canada, the Northwest, even in the Netherlands. We have an office in Rotterdam. And
Wow.
so we transitioned to being a remote company, or at least a remote first company. We still have a few diehards like myself who like to come into the office, but we don't need our 30-person space anymore. So we're downsizing into a WeWork. They've got some nice private offices. We're excited about it. We're going to have a great view of the Texas State Capitol, so maybe that'll be inspiring for our work. But
Yeah.
should be a good transition for us to have a space which fits our staffing levels a little bit better.
Right. Well, you could have used that space for like a bunch of ping pong tables and like barista stuff. You know what I mean? Like in my mind, I think Austin Tech. I'm thinking like virtual reality headsets everywhere and like
Yeah.
everyone running around with like crazy cool things. And you know what I mean? Like,
We could have fit foosball, ping pong, shuffleboard, plus a
yeah,
VR room and one of those golf, little in-house golf things. I
a
think we would have
golf
had the
stadium.
space to do all of that.
No kidding. Well, actually, I'm joking about that, but I won't say the company name just because they might, whatever. But I was in Oklahoma City at a fairly well-known operator's office, and in one of their large conference sort of education areas, they had two basketball hoops, the ones that you see at like the carnival. And it was
Yeah.
funny because like 6 months ago they didn't have it, and then the last time we went there for a meeting, they had it, and so of course we were like, well, can we like shoot some basketball for a bit here? Like everyone's embracing this like fun at workplace environment, which I can appreciate. I think it's cool. Um,
Yeah, for sure.
so you said you're in Austin there. Looking on LinkedIn, I'm assuming it's all true. You went to UT, which is in Austin. You currently work in Austin. You must love Austin. I mean, what's the best part about what's the best part about living there, man? I love it personally. Try going there. I'm in Houston, but tell me about Austin, man. How's it going in Austin nowadays?
Yeah, well, there's a few things that I really like about Austin. First is just the natural environment and the weather and all that is just fantastic. So
Oh yeah.
it's really lovely. I can step outside of my house and go for a walk along the lake and bicycle everywhere and hikes on the greenbelt and all that is fantastic. Especially my background as a geologist, so I appreciate the great outdoors.
Oh yeah.
It's almost a requirement. So that's a nice thing. The city also really has like a buzzy feel going on. That everybody's building things here. It's lots of great tech companies doing things, and there's the university. There's startup accelerators. You can always find an interesting talk or run into interesting, weird people all the time. Interesting and weird, I guess. Interesting, weird, and impressive. That's your trifecta there for current Austinites.
Right.
Yeah,
No, it's super cool. And then what I love about it is that it's such a unique place within Texas, right? Like it hits on like some of the best parts within Texas, but then it has that super interesting twist to it as well. I'm very bullish on Texas and Houston as well. Obviously, I'm here. I'm slightly biased. Austin as well. I mean, are you seeing a huge influx, and just through observation perhaps, or like maybe being out and about with friends and stuff, like are you seeing a lot of folks from say like Silicon Valley esque type communities sort of migrating towards Austin? Or is that kind of what, because on the headlines and you look at things, it's like, oh, everyone from California is moving to Austin. Like, is that true?
Yes, it's true.
Really?
There, yeah, there have been a ton of people coming in from California, from New York, and from various other places around the country, even internationally. Like my wife is half Israeli, and we run into Israelis who've moved here all the time. You know, there's a tech connection for that as well. But I mean, what you're finding is that even though like if you're used to Houston real estate prices and you come to Austin, you know, you should brace yourself for a shock. But if
Yeah.
you're coming from LA or the Bay Area or you know Brooklyn, it's quite a bit cheaper than those. Plus no state tax, and you know you can get a backyard and all of that. So there's definitely been an influx of that. You've got you know big company, obviously like Elon Musk coming in and you know living here
Yeah.
a lot of the year. You know the big move for Tesla here. Oracle moving their headquarters. You've started to have some different venture capitalists from the West Coast start to move here and set down their own shops. Like a big one would be Joe Lonsdale, who runs this place APC, and
Wow.
it's interesting. You know, they've been this influx. It's not like you're just taking the California or the New York mindset and plopping it down in Texas. A lot of those people are moving here to Austin because they kind of believe in hard work and you know the American dream, and they want you know they want to build things, you know, and they're feeling like stunted in the coasts. They're politically open-minded.
Yeah.
You know, so you're actually getting a lot of folks moving here. They're not, I would say, actually kind of changing the climate politically or in terms of you know the culture or anything like that. It's more just kind of throwing gasoline on the fire of what was already kind of building here in Central Texas.
Man, that's so badass. I think it's so neat. And again, it's, you know, so I listened to quite a few podcasts, and a lot of folks, you know, high performing individuals, you know, Elon Musk, whatever, Tim Ferriss, like there's some very unique folks that have like either moved to Austin for a decent amount of time and then moved out, but or who've stayed. But yeah, it just seems, and then isn't Joe Rogan's studio in Austin?
Yes, yeah, he lives here. Yeah, that's kind of surprising. It's actually for whatever reason, the podcasters have kind of decided that this is the place to be. So you have folks like
Yeah,
Joe Rogan, Tim Ferriss, Peter Attia,
that's
Lex
right.
Friedman,
Yeah.
all moving here to Austin and running. And there's you know a dozen others. There's the Modern Wisdom guy, you know, and so they're just like moving down here. I think it's honestly reached a critical mass where if you, and I'm sure Joe Rogan is to thank for a lot of this, but if you're promoting a book and you want to go do the podcast tour, you know, this is actually needs to be on your list along with New York City or LA or wherever any of the other podcast media hubs are.
Yeah, no, that's again, it's super fascinating. And to think I'm just a stone throw away, I feel fortunate, and I don't get there enough. My wife and I, and don't worry, folks, we're gonna get into the energy talk here, but I want to get to know Ted a little bit. So just pump the brakes, relax, we'll get there. You can fast forward if you want to. Uh, but what I was getting at is, so my wife and I love Austin. We've been there a few times. We get an Airbnb, and the Airbnbs we've gotten there have been super cool, for reasonable price. But it was interesting to hear your take, because my wife's in commercial real estate, and so we looked at possibly investing in Austin. And again, coming from Houston, we're like, ugh. But it's nice to hear that from coming from other parts of the country, Austin is still affordable, which then obviously increases the level of attractiveness for folks to continue to come. So it doesn't sound like you've kind of hit the plateau. It sounds like it's ever growing, which again I think is fascinating on many fronts. You know, and to kind of tie it into oil and gas, which is, you know, the sandbox that we both play in here. I think it's important, right, to have that sort of healthy sort of new energy, and you know, new energy as in just new folks and new industry and new tech coming in, to where, like, you know, the incumbent energy source, oil and gas, can leverage that and hopefully evolve the industry in a more positive light, which again, we're going to get a touch on those. The last time I think I was spent any time in Austin, I went to Paleo FX, which I don't know if you're familiar with. It's a big health conference.
No.
Super cool. A bunch of like weird like biohackers and stuff go there. Anyway, but again, cool. I'm glad to see it. Hopefully one day we can cross paths while we're in there. Speaking of tech, did you go to South by Southwest this year?
Not really.
Okay.
Yeah, it's I went to I got my master's degree at the University of Arizona, and they paid top dollar for a University of Arizona Wonder House that they set up across the street from the convention center. So I
Wow.
went there and I got some free chimichangas and a margarita, but that was about it for my South by Southwest experience this year.
Okay. So you said Arizona Wonder House.
Yeah. Well,
Describe that.
so the University of Arizona, they've branded around wonder, here you wonder, or come here to wonder, things like that. I'm butchering the branding a little bit. And so for South by Southwest, drawing on the inspiration for like all the neighborhoods around downtown where somebody, an indie music podcast would go set up the so-and-so house, and it would literally be a house. And so you'd have a little recording studio and bands, and they'd be giving away beer. So it would be, the Spotify house or whatever that's,
Wow.
It's actually in a house. But now that has generalized, and now everybody calls any corporate event like the so-and-so house, even if it's like in a generic office building. So
I'm going to adopt that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I got to get on that train.
Yeah, the Wicked Energy House. Let's do it.
I know, right? God, there's so much opportunity, man. This is great. Speaking of which, opportunity again, for the listeners, again, we were talking and I told Ted, I said, man, the reason I reached out was his content and some of the data that he's putting out. He's doing a phenomenal job. And again, for all the listeners out there, connect with Ted on LinkedIn. If you're into data, and even if you're not, like the way you simplify it to just grasp the concepts of what's happening, whether it be well productivity or any sort of just data relative to sort of macro environment, oil and gas stuff here in the lower 48. It's just super great. I've only been connected with you for a few weeks, but I reached out and said, hey, I'd love to have you on. So here we are. But before we dive in, and we've got some really good topics, so I'm excited, but I'm curious, Ted, when did you start creating content, and what was the goal when you got started? I think for a lot of people, they reach out to me and they're like, hey, I want to get doing content, but I'm not sure why. And I have to convince people on the ROI, blah, blah, blah. Can you just give a high level, like, here's why I did it and here's what I've noticed and why I think more people should type of deal?
Yeah, for sure. So I hired on at Novi back in 2019, and the company was a few years old at that point. And we build software for training machine learning models to do things like production forecasting. So, you're an operator out in the Permian. How many wells should I drill in this section? What should my completion design be? Where should I drill first? Those type of questions. But the technology is still pretty new for the industry, especially like 4 years ago when I was getting started. You still had a lot of people trying to wrap their heads around machine learning and see the use cases, right? And so I actually started doing blog posts and conference papers back in 2020, just to kind of show off what we had. Cool. The other thing is 2020, obviously COVID hit. We all had a lot of spare time on our hands. I wasn't traveling to Houston or Calgary anymore, so I was just locked in my apartment. So, I had a lot of spare time on my hands, and we had kind of realized that we needed to build awareness of the benefits of machine learning and to build some technical credibility. Our core customers are reservoir engineers, geologists, asset managers, and these are technical folks, and they respond to a well-written technical paper, kind of showing off in all the details a specific use case. And then we did that for a few years, but fast forward into kind of last year is when we really got started on putting stuff onto social media, which is what you've run into, Justin. So a couple things happened to drive us in that direction. The first is that we acquired a company called Shale Profile back at the end of 2021. So Shale Profile, actually a small Dutch company, just a small set of guys, and they had been going out to all the different state agencies like the Railroad Commission and the North Dakota Industrial Commission and digitizing and cleaning up all their databases and publishing that as a data service. So, you could think of them basically as they were a young upstart competitor to, the IHSs and the drilling infos of the world, right? So we went out and acquired that business because we had come to the realization that the input data, obvious in retrospect, the input data is almost the most important thing for any machine learning or data science, right? And we realized that we needed control over the input data. And so when we acquired our assets on the kind of base public data across the lower 48, that did two things for us. One is, hey, well, now we have this awesome evergreen data set that has stuff like total production numbers in the Permian that we could just really easily reference and build quick and digestible content off after. And then the other thing is, I'll shout out our digital marketing manager over there, Mohammed. He said, hey, look, here's what the playbook is. Share things that are useful, easy to digest, and people will respond. And it'll build the awareness, and it'll be useful for people to understand who Novi is and what you guys have to offer. And so I said, okay, Mohammed, let's do it. And, kind of really kicked it off there. I guess it was right around a year ago when we started to ramp that up.
Nice. No, and I appreciate the context and sort of the detail behind that, because there's a lot of folks out there and that are not necessarily in the tech space. While I would argue a lot of people are trying to be tech companies that, just so happen to sell whatever widget or tool or,
Sure.
which is great. I think it's the natural evolution of things, but it's how do we communicate our message and how do we get out there and build brand? And I've been a huge proponent of content creation, and I've influenced the company that I work with to get into podcasting and more content, and it's super valuable. And again, like a case in point is, I saw you post things and then I was like, Novi Labs, and started clicking around. And although I'm not a reservoir engineer, I work around a lot of them. I work with mostly drilling engineers, but it's like, if I know guys, hey, you should check out Novi Labs. Like, check out this podcast I did with Ted. Like, you may want to consider this stuff. It's just, it's how this works, which is fascinating. So has the goal changed, like, for you creating more content? Like, are you gonna, like, what does the future of content look for you? And maybe even like, what does it look like for companies like yourselves? Like, do you see, is it just like, hey, let's create as much content as we can, position ourselves as experts, hopefully leading into more sort of, I guess, engagement with the company? Or like, where do you see content creation lying in sort of just business in general? Because I think it's kind of an interesting topic that people are talking about, but there's no real playbook, but people are trying to figure it out.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's been a bit of a transition, like obviously with the rise of the internet and social media, where kind of traditional marketing efforts like a cold call or sending a physical pamphlet to somebody in the mail or stopping by the desk at their office, those aren't really the way that people gain awareness and purchase a software data, a vendor, whatever a vendor is offering, right? It's transitioned to be where they need a while to think about whatever it is that they're potentially in the market for. They're probably not ready to buy something until after they've been thinking about it for 6 months or more. And so what you want to do is be in front of them more often with more touch points, right? And so by us having stuff out there on a regular basis, we can have folks get familiar with our offering, maybe, those are some interesting insights. I hadn't thought about that. Like, we want to provide value to people, right? That's what it ultimately comes down to. And if they, get a warm impression of us associated with that, that's great. So that's a lot of our motivation behind it. And, we try not to be like, we do put out some stuff, which is like highlighting some new feature that we put out there. But in the majority of our marketing is technical content and some memes too, but those are just for fun.
Right. You got to sprinkle memes in there every once in a while.
Yeah, just a little bit.
Yeah, I'm not great on the memes. I never really took the time to like create them, but for a while, like I think during COVID, a lot of people started, again, a lot of time on their hands, started creating a lot of good quality memes. I don't know if you're in the energy FinTwit world, but
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah.
I mean, I think that was like the meme generator. Like on a Friday night, you could go on there and just spend hours looking at people's memes and all the crazy
Yeah.
that's been going out there. But anyway, appreciate, again, the intro and just discussion. Let's move into energy. Again, a lot of good topics. Stuff that you post on is incredibly insightful. But I want to focus specifically on what's happening in the Permian. Again, I think it makes up, almost, I mean, like 47% of the rig count, most of the production. That's again, that's where a lot of the focus is, and specifically on the productivity standpoint. So there's lots of discussion around well productivity and the associated cost of moving to less productive tiered acreage. What are you seeing, or what are your thoughts around this sort of in general, and then where it's going?
Yeah. So this is obviously a topic that people are like really obsessed with right now. And I think you hit the nail on the head. The Permian is so important right now to, like, if it were its own country, it would be one of the top producing countries in the world. I think it's north of Iran and Iraq right now in its total production. So just let that sink in for a moment right there.
Yeah, it's crazy.
And even within the lower 48, like, part of the reason that it's so important right now is that the other oil plays are not growing anymore. If you remove the Permian, the US is down over 1 million barrels a day since pre-COVID in terms of production. And that's because the Eagle Ford, the Williston, the DJ, the Anadarko, those basins are dropping their production. So there's less production coming out of those older, more mature basins right now. So the Permian is the biggest producer, and everywhere else is maybe starting to flag a little bit. So why are people obsessed about the productivity, and what are some of the things that are maybe highlighting it's worth paying attention to right now? Well, the Permian had been basically on an unstoppable march for having more and more productive wells every year until 2022. So you broke like a 10-year streak of having more productive wells than the last year in 2022. So if we like look at some of the hard numbers here, let's look at the 6-month cumulative production for a well. So you can obviously measure how much did the well start producing, how much did it produce over the first 6 months, how much did it produce over the first year, first 2 years, et cetera, et cetera. 6 months is a good balance between you get some recent data and you have a long enough history for it to be a valid data point, right? The early time can be really noisy. So that's a good one to take a look at. So if we look at 2021 wells in the Permian, those peaked at 115,000 barrels a day. So that was the highest production for a single year for the average. So, and actually that itself is pretty staggering, that like the average well in the Permian would produce over 100,000 barrels in its first 6 months, right?
That's crazy.
Yeah. But in 2022, that dropped from 115,000 down to 110,000. So that was the first notable drop. It's only a few percent, right? 4% or so drop, but it's still notable. And it's still also more than 2020. I'll say that, but it's the first notable drop that we've ever had in the aggregate across the Permian.
Okay.
Couple other things that I want to highlight on that. If you normalize by lateral length, you get to see that the production per foot has really kind of started to fall below kind of like a stable number. So a lot of that growth for the past 10 years in the Permian has been because operators have been drilling longer and longer and longer wells, right? So if you drill a 10,000 foot well, that should produce almost twice as much as a 5,000 foot well, right? At least that's, maybe 90%, 90% efficiency rate or something like that. Yeah. So as operators, 10 years ago, maybe they were drilling 5,000 foot wells on average. Now they're higher than 10,000 feet. And so you've doubled your well length. When you normalize for length, you essentially remove the main driver of that increase in production. And you see that the per foot numbers have also started to drop, and they look like they're dropping more than if you just look at the total production numbers. And that's an indication that it's something is going on, right? That it's kind of like a little smoke. It's enough smoke to say that there may be a fire somewhere.
Right, right. No, again, it's fascinating. And some of the stuff that, again, just through conversations, and I don't talk to a lot of reservoir engineers, but looking at like the EIA publishes, and I actually take the data and put it in graphs too, is the new oil production per rig. And yeah, new well oil production per rig in barrels per day. And it ramps up, 13, 14, 15, and then it kind of drops off stable, then sinks in 2020, but then spikes again, and then now comes off, and it seems like it's leveling off. Can you describe that? I've tried to grasp it and wrap my head around it, and I thought I understood it, but the more I think about it, the more I realize I don't quite understand it.
Yeah, I'm happy to help with that, because we like that number, the new oil per rig, is a number that a lot of the media focuses on. Like, for instance, there was a big Financial Times report that used that particular number.
Yeah.
And it's actually, if you're trying to analyze the per well performance, it's not our preferred metric for that. And that's because
I figured. Okay.
Yeah, the denominator of that metric is the number of rigs. It's not the number of new completions or the number of wells. And so the number of rigs can be decoupled from the number of new wells coming online if you are having huge swings in the rig count or the number of DUCs that are being completed, which, like you said, 2020, 2021, we had both of those things happening where operators were dropping tons of rigs. They were leaving wells uncompleted in 2020. And then as you moved into 2021, they picked up those rigs back furiously and completed wells that hadn't been drilled yet. So looking at that statistic, you have a distortion. So that's why we prefer to look at per well metrics rather than the per rig metrics if you're measuring the productivity.
Gotcha. No, and that makes sense. And that's where, again, and I may have actually come along that. And I think there was, some folks on Twitter that had posted, because I think the EIA came out with, they do like daily news and energy or something, and they posted it, and it was like, oh my goodness, all this. Because if you look at like 2020 till now, it's like there's production's going to end in like a year, right? And then so, but then when I plotted it through from the time they started reporting the data, I was like, okay, this actually tells a much different story than what I thought. And then to your point, I started looking at like, what are we actually reporting to which any rig count? It's like, oh yeah, so this maybe isn't telling me what I thought it was, but again, it's easy data to collect and overlay. But so it's interesting, because then that leads into inventory. There's a lot of discussion around. There's some majors, I think, that probably have some good runway, but there's a lot of the smaller companies. I don't want to name them, again, misspeaking, but there's a lot that I'm aware of that are thinking, hey, like within the next 2 or 3 years, it's either we sell or we just kind of like produce and we become a company who's not just going to drill more wells. We're just going to produce and at that point divest. I mean, I don't know, but with all that being said, is most of the people's tier ones getting close to that finish line? And then where does that put it? Like, to me, it all kind of leads towards a bullish case for oil, or it's like the Middle East is just like, like just savoring at the mouth, or other producing parts of the world that are like, where does again? So, tier one versus tier two, is that hype or is that real? I mean, the data somewhat supports tier two is kind of going to be the next, bunch of stuff to produce.
Yeah, it's definitely real. There are some concerns there. When we looked at the numbers last year, we saw that around 2/3 of tier one had been drilled and maybe 50% of tier two had been drilled. In the Permian, we broke it out into 5 tiers rather than 3, just because there's such a wide range of rock quality in the Permian compared to like in the Bakken or the Eagle Ford. It's actually like if you just make a histogram of rock quality, it kind of naturally sorts itself into populations, whereas in the Permian, it's like kind of pretty spread out actually. And that's just because you have so many zones and you have like such a wide area and it's so prolific. So let's just say a little bit of the majority of the best rock has been drilled. And that's going to vary operator by operator. Like when we've looked at it, you can have Some operators actually still have the best to come in terms of inventory left. Other operators, maybe their remaining inventory is slightly worse than they've already drilled. Like Pioneer would be in that category. You have others where they've really drilled a lot of top tier stuff, and you're kind of getting into maybe more of the dregs at that point. Now, when you hear those numbers, you might actually be concerned. Like, oh, they've drilled like over 50% of the best stuff in the Permian, but I'm actually less concerned about it than some others. And let me just give you guys a little context on this. When we looked at the Bakken in 2019, like something like 90% of the tier one had been drilled back at that point. So the Bakken and the Eagle Ford, who have now started dropping production, reached a much higher portion of their top tier rock had been drilled compared to where the Permian is today. So that's pretty notable. When we ran the numbers, even using fairly conservative assumptions about drilling density and things like that, we saw that you maybe had only drilled half of the Permian. And that's because you still had so much of that like tier 3, tier 4 plus stuff left. And a lot of that can still, like, honestly, can still break even at $70 a barrel, and that's just because of the overall quality of the Permian compared to some of the other plays.
Gotcha.
So depending on your assumptions about like the number of wells remaining and drilling densities and rig counts and the pace of drilling, like you may have anywhere between 5 and 10 years of production growth left in the Permian. Now it's not going to, I honestly don't think we're going to go back to the days of having huge spikes in year over year growth. I think operators have clearly shown restraint in how they're going to be approaching their inventory at this point. And it actually makes sense. If you're a mid or a large cap focused on the Permian, like you don't want to drill through your inventory in 3 years. You'd rather take 10, just optically, that, like, what are you going to do if you're going to drill it out in 3 years, right? It's like maybe you see a nice acquisition that you can go make, but it's a lot easier to justify kind of taking your time on that. So I think that's going to be a big consequence of the consolidation that you're having, like private acreage trading hands into the larger publicly traded independents, and those are trading hands into some of the majors. So I think they're going to take a more stable approach to it than as the basin consolidates.
Yeah, well, for the health of the industries and for investors, I think that's a good approach, right? I think, from the outside looking in, I mean, I play in the oil field service side. While, adding a bunch of rigs in a short period of time is fun and exciting, and it, revenue's great, it's just not sustainable. And then we get these massive swings. So if we can somewhat stabilize, it should certainly be helpful, I think, on many fronts. Speaking of which, and you kind of mentioned it, but I'm curious, there's all this talk about, production plateauing in the Permian. It sounds like kind of like, lofty assumption, crystal ball stuff, like within 10 years, or is that kind of the consensus right now, assuming no technological advancements, blah, blah, blah,
Yeah. Well, I did see just a compendium of the consensus the other day. You have different, like, we have our own opinion on this, right? But so does the EIA and the other kind of data providers and things like that. I'd say the consensus is probably that you have between 3 and 7 years worth of growth, and your plateau could be anywhere from 4 to 10 years of production in the Permian.
Gotcha.
But I'd say that's hugely uncertain. Like yesterday we were taking a look at second tier, not second tier, let's call them emerging zones in the Permian. So Wolfcamp D, Wolfcamp C, new Sprayberry zones, new Bone Spring zones. There's even some deeper, gassier zones like, Woodford and things like that are exciting, folks. Within the Midland Basin, just by itself, the Wolfcamp D, Wolfcamp C, Dean, Dean, Upper Sprayberry, which are not the main zones, those are at 400,000 barrels of oil equivalent per day right now. They've been growing like maniacs. Wow. And for context, that's like 2 Powder River basins. So everybody got really excited about the Powder River. Well, like what's the what's the saying? It's like you can make a great meal off of the scraps of the king's table. Well, you know, the Permian is the king here, and
Yeah.
I mean, those zones, the production looks great, you know, and it's just a matter of, do they compete for capital versus the other things on the, you know, on the operator's inventory? Should they be co-developed? But I think we're probably underestimating the extent to which operators will extend that plateau by adding in new zones and by doing kind of subtle geographic expansions around the Permian, you know, maybe proving up an area that wasn't drilled so much, kind of pushing the boundaries.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. And I saw you posted about the C's and D's and just kind of relating to the discussion here right now.
Yeah.
Uh, and it was so I got to thinking, out of all the customers, and I have, you know, quite a few customers that are drilling in the Permian, one of which we started off, and I could never figure out why. And I'm like, why are you guys drilling all these C's? Like the wells are crazy, like they're heavy, they're expensive, they're like
Yeah.
they take 3 times longer. And it was just like, you know, come to find out, like now it makes sense. But the customers that we had, say 3 and 4 years ago, that were drilling nothing but Wolfcamp, you know, A's or AYs, or like this, the sort of the bread and butter Wolfcamp wells. Now they're moving into all these other ones. And so you're starting to see
Yeah.
a shift. And we have a huge chunk of market share out there. So we have quite a bit of visibility on who's drilling what, with many operators, privates and publics. And you're certainly seeing the shift, which is cool to see. And just like any bench or any well, you know, the cost of drilling complete is only going to improve because of the
Right.
efficiency gains and everything else. So those wells will just become more and more economical as we understand the rock better, able to drill it faster and more
Yep.
efficiently, and spacing, and I guess all that stuff that I'm not super familiar with, but we'll continue to get better as an industry, and again, unlock new potential, which is cool, because a lot of the times when you model things, you can't necessarily predict efficiency gains
Yeah.
accurately ish. So, I mean, that could be again, and then through technology too. I don't necessarily know if we'll have another shale revolution per se, but just unlocking those new potentials, I think, is something to look forward to, and just presents so much opportunity.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And I think the cost will come down for those wells. You know, I'm not on the ground talking to people about their D&C costs, but the general trend, as you know, is for the wells to become cheaper. So
Yeah.
yeah, for sure.
So the idea around, again, growing production, and this is something I was thinking about the other day, and it's the idea that as oil prices increase, producers who drill and produce oil will be incentivized to produce oil, but that comes along with associated gas. Right
Yeah.
now, we're at, you know, a supply, you know, we're oversupplied on gas, which is why gas is so, you know, so cheap. So if that holds true as we attempt to grow production, i.e. Permian, which there's a lot of associated gas, they most time can't give it away, we could continue to see natural gas prices continue to dive and dive and dive. Do you think that poses a problem for folks like in the Haynesville and the Marcellus on their ability to produce? Or I guess what's sort of your outlook on natural gas and drilling that up? And is, again, it's just like it's unless we have like extremely cold winters for the next 5 years, and natural gas demand increases, we're kind of in this interesting pickle right now, I feel like.
Yeah. Well, you've hit on a very important ramification of the Permian, and that is the natural gas growth. And actually, the most important natural gas play over the past 2 years in the States has been the Permian. Like
Right.
the Permian's added 4 BCF a day of production, and
Yeah.
that's the Haynesville added 2.5. So it's quite a bit more important than the Haynesville, and Appalachia has basically no change since 2021. So it really is important, and that's being driven by a couple things. One is that the wells naturally will get gassier as they get older. So as the basin as a whole tends to be like, the production is made up of older wells, that means that they're going to be producing more gas on the average. Plus, if operators are maybe starting to poke around in maybe some of the lower tier rock that is a little gassier and has a little lower oil cut, that would also push the average to be more gassy. Although on the whole, right now, we're not like, it's not like super trending in that direction yet, but that's kind of my baseline expectation, is that we're going to start to see the new wells coming online be gassier and gassier as they kind of move out into those areas. It's hard to say what the macro outlook is, because it's all about like the midstream infrastructure and the LNG offtake. And so, you can have your base case that the Permian is going to keep growing and you're going to keep having more and more gas come out of there. The question is just, is that going to be able to find its way to market and ultimately to consumers in East Asia or Europe via LNG in a way that still leaves room for growth from Appalachia or from the Haynesville? And it definitely seems like the loser for all this has been Appalachia, like over the past couple of years, just because obviously they're having trouble with things like the Mountain Valley pipeline and building out any new capacity to get them over that like 35 BCF a day like hurdle where they're kind of stuck at right now.
Yeah.
So it's a question of if they can get enough offtake capacity, and then you're still way closer and easier to build things in the Permian or in the Haynesville to the ultimate markets.
Yeah.
So yeah,
it's funny because I think California and New England are actually at like a gas shortage right now, but like there's so much gas.
Yeah. It's actually like every now and then I'll run into somebody producing in the Rocky Mountains or up in Canada who has exposure to California prices, and they're doing great right now. It's super high prices. It's still such an interesting market, gas. It's not nearly as a universal market with liquid connection between different markets around the world yet. And that's like, here, I'll give you a great example of that. And this is, somebody told me this once and it's stuck in my mind ever since. So the US unconventional wells are the low cost producer in the world. And Marcellus is about the lowest cost gas you can make on the entire planet. And that's because of how productive the wells are. Now there's one or two exceptions, like the Qataris with their quadrillion cubic feet of gas, but we'll just set them aside for a second. Okay. Whereas the oil producers are not the cheapest, they are the marginal producer that's amongst the highest cost in the world. So you have this really interesting dynamic where the shale gas is about the cheapest and the shale oil is about the most expensive. Obviously there's a lot of range within there, and in the Permian they've brought down prices quite a bit for their break evens, but right now that's still generally how it stands. And it's just kind of I think it's an interesting ramification of the shale gas reservoirs just flow a lot better than the shale oil reservoirs do. So, and that's because gas is higher pressure naturally in a lot of these plays. The molecules are smaller, so they'll flow at higher rates. It just kind of works out a little bit better for these tight reservoirs.
Yeah, no, it is fascinating to be on like totally opposite ends of the spectrum, right? But while being a leader in both, I think it's fascinating. Do you suspect, like right now, I think there's 4 LNG terminals or liquefaction plant or whatever they're called, being built to ultimately increase export capacity for LNG. These are very expensive. They're big projects, big money, big capital. Do you think, are you aware of like more and more people looking to dive into that to where we'll be able to increase capacity beyond that? Because I've only heard up until like 2027 where we're at. But I mean, and again, there's so much time between now and then. But I mean, again, because of how much we sit on, we could be, which we already are, but increase our degree of sort of global market strength in LNG exporting. Is that a thing you think? Or are we going to kind of hold tight there? Or?
Well, I'm not concerned about our ability to produce the gas. I'm more concerned about our appetite for building these large scale, like mini billion, like I don't know, $30 billion to build an LNG train or whatever it is. It's a multi-billion-dollar expenditure, and it takes 5 years to build it or 10 years or whatever it is. So, that's not my expertise, but we do have like just vast amounts of gas here that just aren't being drilled right now because it could be produced so cheaply from Appalachia or Haynesville or from the Permian, right?
Yeah.
And you also, you get up into Canada, you have the Montney, it's just another huge gas play up there. And I don't have any total numbers, but in terms of its footprint, it's just super gigantic. The wells are incredibly productive, but it suffers from a lot of the strengths, the same infrastructure constraints actually are kind of worse up there than they are here in the lower 48. So you have that, you have all these Rocky Mountain basins that we have in the United States, San Juan, Green River Basin, the Powder River Basin to some extent. But a lot of these basins just have a lot of gas in them. And, your well might produce 6 billion BCF EUR in one of those basins. You can't compete with a Marcellus well that might do 18 or 20, but it's still a ton of gas. And if you were actually able to make like LNG prices, at $10 at that location, you could justify a lot more development. I mean, plus all the gassier parts of the Permian would look good. There's a lot more left to be done in the Anadarko. There's parts of the Gulf Coast. It's just there's just so much gas in North America. So that I'm not worried about that side. I'm just worried about our appetite for these big infrastructure projects.
Well, we need a demand revolution and just like somehow learn how to consume more.
It's honestly, it's not hard. Like natural gas is an awesome fuel. You turn on your plant almost instantly. It's cheap. If you talk about energy return on investment, like these natural gas wells are like, aside from maybe nuclear, they give you the best return. They give you much better return than oil. They don't pollute a lot. It's an incredible fuel, natural gas. And it's just, obviously you have the carbon emissions that are a concern and scare away some jurisdictions for building more capacity there. But it's a really remarkable fuel.
Yeah, no, that's true. And kind of sticking with the unconventional topic, and you alluded to just different benches within the Permian, but are there any emerging unconventional plays that folks are exploring, any unique opportunities aside from what we talked about, either domestically or internationally? I mean, anything that's got you excited or thinking about?
Yeah, well, I'll call out a couple here. Number one, I'll call out the Uinta, which has been exploding recently. So the Uinta Basin, a lot of folks probably have never heard of it. It's a Rocky Mountain basin. It's in Utah, and then it kind of extends into the Piceance Basin in Western Colorado. So it's the kind of Uinta Piceance Basin out there. And its production there has been skyrocketing from these unconventionals. I think it's doubled in the last year and a half or something like that. The footprint of the play is not super huge. It's a relatively small play. But the wells are incredibly productive. The wells from Ovintiv or XCL, who are both active there, are just as competitive as a top tier Delaware Basin well. They're really that good.
Wow.
And it's kind of interesting. The basin is unique geologically for North America in that the rocks are lacustrine. They're deposited in a lake. So we don't have a lot of lacustrine source rocks that turn into these unconventionals here in North America. They're much more common in places like China and Rift Basins, East Africa, places like that. But here in the United States, almost everything is from ancient oceans rather than ancient lakes. And so it kind of, because it's different geologically, and so you kind of have to approach it differently and evaluate it differently. It also produces a lot of wax. So the crude tends to be very waxy. It'll solidify at room temperature.
Oh yeah.
So if you produce your oil and leave it in the tank, it'll turn into just like a candle, like a wax candle,
Yeah.
So you have to use like a heated truck to take it to a rail terminal that would then transport the crude down to another heated terminal in the Gulf Coast or in the Pacific Northwest. So it has some wrinkles that make it a little different, but the wells are incredible. So that's one that I'm pretty excited about right now. The Vaca Muerta down in Argentina is incredible. The wells are also just as good as the best wells in the Permian. Yeah. And for there, it's just a question of the infrastructure and the politics. The geology is just as good as the Permian or the Eagle Ford. It's just building up the local supply chain. Sand is much more expensive down there than it is here in the lower 48. You have trouble getting your dollars out of the country because they have issues with foreign currency reserves and exchange rates and things like that. So it's got a lot going on there. The other one, the Middle East, is actually starting to really pick up with their unconventional. So Saudi Arabia is getting really serious about their shale gas. It's called the Jafurah Basin. And from everything that I've looked at, it's got incredible potential. They've been keeping the well results very tight, keeping their cards close to the vest there on that one. But the geology, it looks just as good as the Marcellus, honestly.
Wow.
So we'll kind of see how that one goes. That'll be an interesting one to keep an eye on. And there's a couple other little smaller unconventionals in the Middle East that folks are taking a look at in, Oman and some other places. So
how is it just through research and reading that you?
Yeah, most of these will have technical papers that people have presented, or researchers have put a, hey, here's what the TOC is, and the organic content of the reservoir, and here's the thickness, and here's the pressure, and here's the porosity, and all the things that you would normally look at if you're evaluating a play. You can kind of scrape them roughly together. Obviously, there's nothing as good as a well test, to let you know what the productivity it is. But just from those top level things, you can make a pretty good look.
Very cool. No, that's exciting. There's a ton of plays out there that I suspect that we're sitting on a bunch more than what we think. And although what we think, the amount of reserves throughout the world, and even here in the US, it feels like, regularly there's news of that just continuously increasing. So again, just presents so much opportunity for folks around the world. I want to take a quick pivot, and I want to respect your time. I'm sort of running up already on the top of the hour here. If you have a couple minutes, I have another few questions. Unless you got to burn, I'm happy to wrap this up. Ted, would you let me?
Let's do it. Let's do it.
Okay. Real quick, you had a solid run again, according to LinkedIn, ConocoPhillips and their geology department, before moving into the analytics, energy analytics space, which I think is cool, right? It's a natural progression. But I'm curious on sort of your take on the current landscape of just AI and data analytics. Again, the whole like ChatGPT thing has rolled out, which is like AI has been around, but now it's kind of brought into the mainstream where like regular consumers can actually leverage AI. But is that something that is, I guess, noise for someone like you, or like how is AI and then again the analytics piece evolving, and where is that going to go in the near future here?
Yeah, well, it's definitely stuff that we hear people asking questions about all the time, and have conversations with. And I think it's worth making a little distinction here between maybe the broad approaches that we would take for things like production forecasting and things like ChatGPT or the other generative AI tools or image recognition or things like that, right? So for what we work with in oil and gas, we have tabular data, like you have a table, like an Excel spreadsheet. So that's, here's what the well was designed with, or here's what the pipeline diameter and steel type was and all that, right? It's tabular data. And then we have time series data, which is, this is what the production was in February, here's what it was in March, here's what it was in April, et cetera, or by the day, that type of a thing. And a lot of the developments for image recognition or generative AI have been on neural networks, and they require tons and tons of input data to train on. So in contrast, within oil and gas, we have tabular data, we have time series data, which is a little different than what like the type of data that those new developments have been working on. And then we also, to be honest, we don't have nearly the data volume that those other things that you heard about have access to. So ChatGPT is trained on the entirety of the internet. It's like, trillions of characters and people's blog posts and Twitters and research papers and textbooks and anything it can get hands on. It has this incredible library, and a lot of those algorithms, when you throw a huge volume of unstructured data, just throw it in there. You can use an algorithm which has a high capacity to learn, but it may not need to be that complicated, just like a high capacity. Right. So you put in all that data through one of these high capacity algorithms, it can give you incredible results. Same thing with like training an algorithm to play really good at chess, or something like that. Whereas what we have smaller volumes of data that's noisy, it's messy, it's a different kind of data type. It tends to be more structured than what the other folks deal with. And so we, for our approach and a lot of other folks for things like production forecasting or flagging whether a pipeline is going to rupture, we'll use different algorithms than the ones that are kind of getting a lot of the press, So those might be decision tree based algorithms, gradient boosted trees, random forests, things like that. They actually tend to do better for our class of problems, and that's why we do it. But I do think it is exciting. I think you will probably start to see some businesses figure out ways to use those recent developments. Like maybe you have one of those large language models like ChatGPT that can, read a drilling report for you and summarize the information off of it, or things like that. So I'm sure that some smart entrepreneurs out there are going to figure out some creative ways to use those new data types. The other thing that's like been interesting that like we have really learned over the past, 5 or 6 years, and it's been my own experience, but the industry, oil and gas industry, wasn't really necessarily ready for data analytics. And that's because our data was in terrible shape collectively. Everybody should be raising their hand and admitting that we had a data problem. And, the data was in a spreadsheet on somebody's computer, or it was in 20 different databases, and it's not updated and it's not live, and there's inconsistencies and all sorts of problems like that. And honestly, we had to get our data in order collectively before we can actually make use of a lot of these cool new algorithms and models that have come out recently. So that's been like the big surprise for us, is just kind of, hey, even if you have this amazing algorithm, if you feed it garbage data, you're not going to get a good result. And so we've gotten to see a lot of our customers like go on this journey of getting their data in good shape. And there's still a lot of issues with the data that we run into. And we've been, becoming more and more involved with even just cleaning up the production data, to start with, which you'd be amazed at how many companies don't even have good production data for their own wells. It's pretty incredible. And probably their production engineer or their operations folks have good access to the data, but it's not something that the whole company or even folks in reservoir engineering or their IT group maybe have like super great access to.
Right.
And we'll find things like their database just kind of only started in 2021. It's like, hey, did you guys start drilling in 21? They're like, oh no, sorry, the production from before that we don't know where it is. It's like, okay, great. Let's see if we can find that. It gets just like little things like that.
That's crazy, man.
Yeah, happens all the time.
Right, which is wild to me, right? Because aren't you? I mean, again, I don't know, but I thought you were obligated by the DOE or whoever to like actually report data to them for.
Every state has their own requirements on how much data you're required to provide, and the companies by and large are following the law and reporting the data on the required time frames. But there's one thing which is reporting your data, and there's another in some quality or another, and there's another in keeping this database going that is consistent, it's live, it has all the historical data in it, in addition to the stuff which is being produced today. Most companies have a good idea of what's happening today, and they just may not have that for their entire organization. It may not be connected up to the prior production.
Right.
Or it could be that between, the wellhead and the operations engineer, the production engineer, and by the time it gets to IT, maybe somebody messes up a unit or a conversion factor or something like that. That also happens a lot. I
can see that. So it kind of sounds like just as an industry, we're in like the second or third inning of actually like managing data, collecting data, and leveraging data. It sounds like we're still trying to figure out the first couple innings.
There's been a lot of progress made over the past 4 or 5 years. So some companies I'd say are in the 7th inning or the 9th inning. There maybe the game's already done, but other companies are still climbing up that curve.
Okay, so, cool.
But that's part of the reason why we decided like, hey, let's just go build this incredibly high quality public data set, so that everybody would have access to at least a good, even if your own data wasn't ready for prime time, hey, we have this great data set for the Permian. I'll give you one example. This is something I definitely want to talk about. We've been going out. So actually, let me set the stage here.
Yeah.
So in Texas, when you're reporting your production to the state, if you're an operator, you report it for the entire lease. So you know, you have this ranch out in West Texas, you've leased it from the ranchers, and you go and you drill your wells, right? Well, you may have 3, 5, 10, 20, 100 wells on the lease, depending on how big it is.
Right.
And all you have to report to the state is what all of those wells produced together. You don't report what the individual wells produced, with the exception of you do report from time to time, like let's say once a year, how you test the well for a 24-hour period and you say, here's what it produced today. You know, so there's a lot of uncertainty within Texas about what the wells produce at the individual well level. So let's tie this back to the conversation we were just having. Some operators drilling Wolfcamp A, B, C, and D wells on their lease. You're interested in, hey, is there Wolfcamp D potential on my acreage? Well, there's a lot of uncertainty about what all those individual wells are doing. And so you have to make some estimates of what the Wolfcamp D wells are producing on that multi-well lease.
Yeah.
So that's the big challenge that we have working in Texas in terms of the data. There's some other things, but that's the big one. So every company who provides data has what's called a lease to well allocation algorithm. And what that is you kind of take the total production from the lease and you assign the production, you know, let's say the whole lease produced 300,000 barrels in April. So you say, all right, well, we think that 10,000 came from this well and, you know, whatever. So you go across however many wells it is. But what we have done is we have started going out to operators and minerals companies and getting licenses to their proprietary data so that we can publish actual well level data rather than data that's been allocated from the lease to the well level.
Nice.
So what that means is that everybody gets a more accurate perspective on what everything is doing in Texas, rather than having to have this essentially fog about what the individual wells are producing because of the lease to well allocation. So we've made a ton of progress on that. We only started this like 6 months ago, and we've got, I think, 750,000 barrels a day of production in Texas. And it's focused on the Permian, are coming from actual well level data. So that means that something like a third of the Permian now has nearly zero error on what the wells are actually producing for the lease to well allocation.
And
so
this is you guys approaching certain operators and them giving you access to that?
Yeah. What we've been finding actually is that folks have kind of come to the realization that, hey, everybody in the industry is dealing with this problem of the lease to well allocation. Why don't we just, I'm happy to share the data with you, Novi, like you can have it. Yeah. Some companies just give us the license. Other ones we give them like a report back, like we'll process their production data and give them a report back and say like, hey, here are the issues that we found, you know, hey, and that's a value to them. And then in some cases we'll give them a nice big discount to share their data with us, you know. Yeah. But the benefit is everybody gets access to higher quality production data, which is the core of any analysis that you're doing at the end of the day, you know.
Yeah.
So
no kidding. Huh.
It's been a really exciting thing recently.
No kidding. I mean, in that, because it's so to your point, in coming from the Canadian oil field, where, I mean, and this is again a little different, but the access to information for wells and operators was so much easier. I could go down to the OGC and I could pull up any well that was drilled in Alberta. I could look at the IEDC reports, everything else. And then when I came to the US, it's like the only data you had access to is the one that you actually drilled. And I was like, well, wait, no, but there's an offset well like 2 miles away. Like, I want to know what happened. They're like, well, I don't know. We'll call a buddy. They may have it. And I was like, what? And so it was an interesting sort of experience going from somewhere where it was like, we love sharing data versus down here was like, it gives us that competitive edge and we don't want to share. I'm speaking in generalities here, obviously, but
sure.
So it seems like the sort of the culture around data, proprietary versus public data is sort of shifting and saying, hey, if we want to actually grow in our ability to actually get better, because we're all stuck up against kind of this wall that we all have to get over.
Exactly.
Let's maybe work together instead
Yeah,
of not.
that's what we're finding. Yeah. And we've
That's
been doing some similar things for some of our customers to share. Like the other thing in Texas, and this will also come as a shock to you coming from Canada, but in Texas, the only completions data that's reported publicly is proppant fluid, just the total numbers. So you don't know what
wow.
was the stage design. You don't know the cluster design, right? And that can have obviously a huge impact on the performance. There are some very small exceptions of like maybe 1 or 2% of wells where that is published, but it's very small. So we also have we have like a little network for sharing that data going as well for our customers. So it's been, I think we're seeing that generally everyone is coming to appreciate the value of sharing their proprietary data because like you said, most people are locked into their positions at this point. The value for everybody improving their performance compared to the value of information is just shifting more towards everybody improving rather than like, it's like the Permian's leased up, you're not, it's not like an emerging play where
Yeah.
you have to go get, where the value of the acreage can swing from, 1,000 up to $60,000 an acre or anything like that. It's people
Right.
are locked in. There's value to sharing at this point. Rising tide lifts all boats. So
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
been a big thing that we've been trying to encourage, and we're finding that operators and mineral companies are really starting to believe that.
Very cool. And so, do you think production forecasting is going to improve because of a lot of that stuff?
Oh yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, we've seen like, and this will be the case for a reservoir engineer doing their own forecasting, but in our own models using our data, our kind of public quote unquote or public and proprietary data sources, like you can have a pretty significant reduction in the error of the forecast by including that higher quality data, which obviously makes sense. But you can maybe reduce the error by 30%, something like that. So
Wow.
you get a much more accurate forecast by having that accurate data.
That's huge. And again,
Yeah.
it's like that everyone hangs their hat on, trying to forecast. And so,
Oh yeah,
uh,
exactly. It's the core.
yeah, no, it could completely change people's models and economics, and ultimately it drives better decision making and less assumptions, hopefully.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, production is cash flow at the end of the day, right? So it's the most important thing.
Yeah, no kidding. Well, Ted, this has been again a fantastic conversation. I feel like we could have gone down several different avenues, but in the interest of time and everyone's capacity to listen in, appreciate it if you made it this far. But I encourage everyone to reach out, connect with Ted. And again, if you're in the reservoir space, or if or even if you're not, but just check out Novi Labs' website. They're up to some really fascinating stuff. They're in the hub of tech and energy tech there in Austin. So I mean, if they can, if anyone can do it, it sounds like Novi can. And so Ted, one last question to kind of wind things down, more on a personal level, and you may have known this question was coming, but I'm curious, man. I mean, you're like myself, kind of younger, you're in Austin, you like to be active. What's something about yourself that not many people know about, or what are some interesting hobbies, or what do you do when you're not diving into the data, creating content? Obviously, you say your wife there, hanging out with her. What's kind of the unplugged Ted look like?
Oh man, unplugged Ted. Well, every Saturday we go on a nice long walk on the green belt in Austin. So
Nice.
it's if you're ever in town, it's the Barton Creek Greenbelt. It's
Huh.
Barton Springs is the famous pool
Oh,
and
yeah.
in Austin, which you should definitely go visit.
Is that the
It's
nude one?
not nude.
Oh,
No, not nude. No, but it's like 72 degrees spring fed year round. So it's always like super pleasant. But if you
nice.
go upstream of that, there's I think it's 8 mile long hiking trail. You can really almost like, it feels like you're not in Austin anymore.
Cool.
You've got cliffs and all the trees and squirrels and birds and all that. So we try to get out there and get a couple hour hike in every day. And there's actually a couple other swimming holes on the creek as well, but you can go to like Sculpture Falls is pretty awesome, or Twin Falls. So definitely recommend that if you guys are up in Austin. I always enjoy going on that walk.
Perfect. No, appreciate that. And again, if you haven't been awesome, you need to check it out. And with that said, everyone, really appreciate you listening. Ted, aside from LinkedIn, do you play on any other social platforms that you do with your data and then sort of the content you create, or is that pretty much?
Yeah. So I've just started getting active on Twitter, so
Nice.
it's coming along. So at Ted
Attaboy.
Cross, you can find me there on Twitter.
Okay.
And then I do write on Substack as well. That's usually going to be a little more geology focused than necessarily like oil and gas data analytics, but you can find that at tedcross.substack.com. I've actually got one on there about Barton Springs and the swimming holes in Texas. So if you want to read up about the geology of those, that'd be a great place to take a look.
That's awesome, man. Well, as a geologist, I commend you, because most of the geologists that I've met are not as outspoken and extroverted and are willing to put themselves out there. You're a unique breed, man, and I can certainly appreciate it. And no disrespect for the geologists out there. Again, I know a bunch of them, and we're all great people regardless. But and for the listeners, really appreciate it. Please leave a review, subscribe, share this with someone who's in the space that could find value in listening to what we talked about today. Again, it's just like, let's continue to spread the message, educate each other, help each other. And remember, as always, everyone deserves access to energy, and we is greater than me. Thanks, everybody.